The Wealthy Life is brought to you by investment dealer Raymond James. Life well planned. See what a Raymond James advisor can do for you.
Should the government decide who your beneficiary is? With me today is Senior Estate Planning Advisor Cindy David. Welcome, Cindy. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I often hear people who don't have a will. That just sounds so crazy to me. Why is it important to have a will?
Well, if you don't have a will, it's called dying intestate, and it means that you're letting the government decide who your beneficiaries are, and it might not be who you would choose.
Well, that's scary, and I know the biggest reason people don't have a will is they say, A, I'll be dead anyway, so who cares? It's somebody else's problem. Or maybe their estate isn't very big. Maybe they don't understand what it means.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, the smaller your estate, it's almost more important to have a will so that what you have actually gets into the hands of your beneficiaries. The government has chosen your beneficiaries for you, and they've applied some logic to it, so some of it makes sense. But the biggest risks are in blended families. If you are assuming that everything is going to go to your surviving spouse, that may not be the case. And also if you have minor children. A lot of people don't have wills because they struggle with who's going to be the guardian of my kids if I'm not here, and it has much less to do with the money side of it, but both are important.
Yeah, I could see that getting confusing, especially in blended families. And do you see sometimes in cases where there isn't an up-to-date will that money will actually go to an ex-spouse? Or what's the worst story you've
probably
seen?
The worst and funniest story is that you can actually die having two spouses in BC. That's a possibility.
Who knew?
Yeah.
Well, that would be a nightmare from an estate planning perspective. So I know a lot of our viewers want to know, what is probate?
Really good question. So a lot of people want to move mountains to plan around probate. And what probate is that it's not a tax, it's a fee that you have to pay in order to have your will processed, basically. So the first step in estate planning, actually before having a will, is consider what you could give away during your lifetime. And that avoids the process of your will giving it away to surviving beneficiaries. Probate is a fee that applies to anything that your will gives away. If you give it away sooner, then there's no probate that applies. Keeping in mind that in BC, the maximum fee that it can be is 1.4% of the total value of your estate that your will is giving away. In relation to taxes, which could be as high as 43.7%, we want to focus more on taxes than probate. But there are things you can do to avoid probate. Lifetime gifts, I've already mentioned. Naming beneficiaries on things you're allowed to name beneficiaries on, which are registered assets, your RRSPs, tax-free savings accounts, and life insurance products. You can name beneficiaries and they go directly to the beneficiary first, and your will gives away what's left.
Which is kind of nice because people want to get their hands on the money as soon as they can. But I think what you're saying is sometimes people worry too much about what the probate fee is going to be.
Exactly.
And ignore a lot more complicated implications.
Yeah,
second.
That's true. The third way of avoiding probate is joint ownership. So I get asked a lot in client meetings, does it make sense to put my home into joint names with my children? And I have a rule of thumb around that. The answer is no for a really long time, until maybe there's only one of you left and your kids have gone through any marriages and divorces that they might go through, because that's the risk of joint ownership. So there's a time that's appropriate for joint ownership, but there's also a time where it could be too soon.
I know I get this a lot from clients trying to figure out how to save probate fees, and so they think they're being smart and they want to put their kids' names on their investment accounts, even at a young age. What are some of the things that can happen if they do that?
Well, it is true ownership. So the first rule of thumb is to own and control everything that you might possibly need during your lifetime. So focus on retirement before you focus on estate planning. And the risk of joint ownership is that if your children get married and subsequently divorced, you could lose a much bigger part of your asset than the probate that you're trying to save.
I don't think people want their money going to their son or daughter's ex-spouse.
That's true. 100% of the time.
So working with a professional is key. This is a little bit overwhelming for the average person. How often should they review their will and make sure it's up to date?
Good question. Not every year, but certainly since we've just had a change in legislation around wills that took place in March 31st, 2014 in BC, now is a really good time to just have your will reviewed, put it in front of a lawyer, and make sure that it matches the current legalese in legislation. And quite frankly, there were a lot of conflicting legislation having to do with how estates were managed. So a lot of reasons that your estate might end up in court are no longer built into the legislation. We fixed a lot of problems, but you need to make sure that your will is up to date.
So what you're saying is the rules have changed and are changing over the next little while. So it's more important than ever for everyone out there to make sure that their will still holds up under the new regulation?
Everyone, even if your will is really basic, I would just have it reviewed by a lawyer to give a thumbs
So get your
up.
will reviewed. Don't delay. Good advice. Now, what are some of the other changes with the regulation?
There's a lot of change right now. It's a really exciting time. It's also a really scary time. So we know
Exciting for you, maybe.
Yeah, lots
Not
to
for
do.
us.
We know that the wills legislation has changed in BC. There's also some major changes to trust legislation. The good news is we've been given a heads up. So we have until January 1, 2016 before the new rules kick in. And it has a lot to do with tax changes. So now is a good time to be talking to someone like me who specializes in estate planning. It might not be your financial advisor or investment advisor. It might not be your accountant or even your lawyer. Somebody who you can sit down and talk to say, does this change to trust legislation affect me? And should I change my will as a result of it?
Now, another question that a lot of people ask is, I've got all these things to save for. Where's the right spot to save? RSP, tax-free savings account. Where do I put my money and where do I get it out from later?
So you're really talking about two different things. There's the retirement component, where is the best place to put my money while I'm saving for retirement? And when I get to retirement, where's the best place to spend from so that I'm not taxed inappropriately in my estate?
Because when you die, boom,
yeah,
everything gets taxed.
A lot of things get taxed. So we don't have a state tax in Canada now yet. I've been predicting that for 20 years. We might end up like the US where they do in fact tax your assets. In Canada, we have tax on income. So that's really the focus. When you are in retirement, you want to focus on getting money out of your savings plans in the lowest tax bracket possible. And we have lots of lovely things like income splitting on pension income and RIF income to keep couples in lower marginal tax brackets. But if you don't spend from the right asset and you die owning, for example, your RSPs, tend to trigger a lot of tax in estates because the entire bucket is considered taxable income in a single year. So what you often see is on the first spouse's death, everything rolls over to the surviving spouse, and now they have a bigger RSP because it's combined. There's a spousal rollover provision. On the second spouse's death, the entire amount is considered taxable income, and that's a surprise to most Canadians.
So when it comes to estate planning, there's a couple of key takeaways. One is make sure your beneficiaries really are your beneficiaries and your money goes where you want it to go. And two, planning ahead can help minimize or help you prepare for some of the taxes.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Cindy. I really appreciate you taking time to be with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.